Before she became a myth, she was just a girl, born into a dying kingdom, surrounded by knives, and told, "Survive." You've heard the name Cleopatra, but do you really know her story? Not the Hollywood love triangles, not the snakebite, the real story, the one written between betrayal and brilliance, between power and silence. She wasn't just a queen, she was a strategist, a survivor, a storm behind silk curtains. In this story, you'll witness the unthinkable, how she outmaneuvered generals, seduced the world's most powerful men, and made herself a queen in a world where queens were never meant to rule. You'll see her first great gambit, Caesar, not a love story, power move. And when he was gone, she didn't fade, she rose again. Then came Antony, a soldier, a lion, and the one man who thought he could tame her. Their alliance would shake Rome to its core. Their downfall would change the world. You'll witness the propaganda war, the donations of Alexandria, the final sea battle at Actium, where love, ambition, and empire all collided, and only one survived. You'll see the death as history told it, and then you'll see the silence, where truth might live. You'll meet Caesarion, her son, born of Rome, claimed by Egypt, his life erased, his death never confirmed. And when it's all over, we'll follow the myths, the missing tomb, the magic, the mystery that still lingers beneath the sand. Cleopatra didn't just die, she vanished, by design. So if you think you know Cleopatra, the seductress, the icon, the queen who died for love, think again. Because this is the entire life of Cleopatra.
Only I can lead Egypt into a new era of prosperity!
The queen you have not seen before. Before she was legend, Cleopatra was only a girl. She was born not in myth, but in marble. In 69 BCE, Alexandria shimmered with salt wind and ancient memory. Egypt was already old, its pyramids older still. And yet, in the palace above the sea, something new stirred, the birth of a girl who would be both queen and question. She was Cleopatra VII, daughter of Ptolemy XII, the flute-playing king, the seventh of her name, but unlike those who came before. Her blood was Greek, her cradle Egyptian, her lineage foreign, yet her gaze held the Nile. She did not cry often. She listened. She watched. The palace was full of masks, courtiers who smiled too widely, servants who whispered too quietly. Power here did not roar. It shifted. Cleopatra learned to notice the shift. Tutors taught her to read in Greek, to speak in Egyptian. She requested Latin. She traced stars and memorized trade winds. She knew when feasts grew silent, when coins disappeared. She saw her father's fear of Rome before she understood why. She was not yet queen, but the court began to notice her silence. The priests spoke of her eyes. The scribes noted her questions. One evening, her tutor said, "All things return to the river," and the river waited. When her father left for Rome, the palace trembled. But Cleopatra stood still, a child, watching, listening, remembering. Her father was gone, the court shifted, and Cleopatra, still and silent, stood where the Nile could see her. The storm was coming. The river does not rush, it only waits, and while it waited, the king died. In the halls of Alexandria, a silence fell, not the silence of peace, but of change. Ptolemy XII, once called the flute player, left behind a fragile crown and a divided court. His death came quietly, no blades, no poison, just a fading breath and the soft closing of doors. Cleopatra was 18. Her name had already whispered through the city, but now it echoed louder. Her father's will named her co-ruler, alongside her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, a child. A king in name, a boy in form. The court stirred. Advisors rearranged chairs. Scrolls were rewritten. Old loyalties shifted like sand. Cleopatra stood calm among them. She had waited for this moment, not with ambition, but with understanding. Power was not granted. It was taken softly, carefully, as one takes a fragile cup from trembling hands. For a time she ruled. Her image appeared on coins. Her voice guided laws. She spoke directly to emissaries. Egypt listened, but not everyone did. Behind the marble, shadows moved. The regents of her brother whispered warnings. Cleopatra had risen too far, too fast. And so the tide turned. The palace she knew became cold. Guards changed. Doors closed. Letters went unanswered. And one morning, without trumpet or fire, Cleopatra was gone. Exiled. Left beyond the palace walls, the river watched, waiting. In the distance, Rome moved, and in the shadows of exile, Cleopatra planned not a return, but an entrance. One that would change everything. One that would arrive, hidden in folds of red cloth. The desert held its breath. Beyond the stones of Alexandria, where palace columns rose toward cloudless skies, Cleopatra waited. She was no longer queen in the eyes of the court, no longer welcome within the walls she once walked silently. But exile was not emptiness. It was stillness, and in stillness she listened. Far from the throne she built a camp. Quiet men, trusted voices, coins spent not on war, but on patience. Whispers traveled faster than soldiers, and in every whisper, her name returned like dust upon wind, faint but constant. Alexandria, meanwhile, shifted restlessly. Ptolemy XIII, her younger brother, ruled with the voices behind him. Men who feared change. Men who clung to power like it would keep them from drowning. The palace halls had grown louder, but no wiser. Then came Rome. Pompey the Great arrived first, defeated and desperate. He begged sanctuary and received a sword. His body was offered to Caesar as proof of loyalty, but Caesar did not nod. He stared at what was left of an old friend, and the air grew stiller. Cleopatra watched from afar. She marked the moment. She knew Caesar had not come for revenge, but for order, for power, and power listens carefully. She was ready. Not with armies, but with a single perfect entrance. The kind that would echo through marble and memory. The kind only silence could prepare. The palace shimmered in lamplight. Caesar sat beneath high columns, observing more than he spoke. Ptolemy XIII, small in stature but wrapped in royal gold, stood beside him. His advisors filled the room with rehearsed words, but none of them settled. There was tension in the marble, silent, sharp. Then came the carpet, a large, ornate roll carried by silent servants. It moved across the floor like a forgotten relic. Caesar's eyes followed it. No one explained. No words were offered. Only stillness. The rug was unrolled, and from its folds she emerged. Cleopatra, poised, calm, eyes like still water. She did not stumble. She did not bow. She stood, centered and unafraid. She had returned not with armies, but with intention. Not demanding attention, but commanding it. Caesar studied her. She said nothing. Neither did he. In that moment there was no court, no brother, no empire, only two minds, measuring each other in silence. Cleopatra had played her move. It was bold, unpredictable, but flawless, and with it the board was set anew. The palace had always held whispers. Now they sharpened. Cleopatra's return had not come with swords, but it struck deeper than any blade. Her presence, calm and deliberate, unsettled the court more than any battle might. She had walked into power wrapped in silence, and silence, once broken, spreads. In private chambers, the advisors of Ptolemy XIII murmured with unease. They spoke of betrayal, of insult, of danger cloaked in silk. The boy king did not speak much. He watched the others. His youth gave them control, but control began to tremble. They had welcomed Caesar to secure their position. Now Caesar had chosen her. He did not announce it. He did not command it. But his actions, subtle, precise, made it clear. He listened when Cleopatra spoke. He invited her counsel. He stood beside her at court. The young queen, once exiled, now stood in the heart of power. The court split in two. Some remained loyal to the boy, bound by fear or favor. Others, quietly, shifted toward Cleopatra, drawn not by force but by presence. She made no promises. She offered no reward. But in her calm, there was clarity. And in Caesar's shadow, there was safety. Outside the palace, unrest began to ripple. People whispered of the queen's return, of the Roman general who had rejected the boy's offering, of the carpet, and the woman who rose from it like a story unfolding. In the marketplace, voices grew louder, not in protest but in wonder. But power does not move easily. Ptolemy's advisors saw their hold slipping. They summoned soldiers, locked gates, sent messengers behind closed doors. Their power was not gone, but it was no longer unquestioned. The tension grew heavier. Within walls of stone, allies turned into watchers. Every conversation had weight, every glance, a meaning, and Cleopatra remained still. She had returned with silence. She ruled now with stillness. She knew power often breaks itself trying to resist its own reflection. And she had become a mirror. Tension does not shout. It hums. Within the palace, the quiet was no longer peaceful. It was strained. Doors closed more quickly. Eyes lingered longer. Words arrived half-spoken and left unfinished. The stillness Cleopatra had shaped now trembled under weight. The advisors of Ptolemy XIII no longer whispered. They plotted. They saw the Roman general standing beside the returned queen, and they saw the future slipping from their hands. Orders were given in back rooms. Letters dispatched at night. Soldiers, once stationed at the gates, now stood closer to Caesar's quarters, just in case. Caesar, ever still, said little, but his gaze had hardened. He was not unaware. He had walked through war before. He knew what it looked like before it started. Cleopatra remained composed. She did not ask for protection. She did not plead for arms. She sat in open court, speaking in measured tones, her fingers resting lightly on parchment. Her power was not in declarations, but in the way others began to wait before speaking, wondering first what she might say. But silence has a limit. One morning, shouts echoed across the corridors. The boy king's advisors had moved. They ordered Caesar's quarters surrounded. Roman banners were torn from balconies. In the courtyard, a column of soldiers assembled. Not foreign invaders, but Egyptian guards, wrapped in red and anger. Caesar stepped into the marble halls, calm as stone. He gave no command. His presence was enough. His soldiers moved not in chaos, but precision. And then the silence broke. Steel clashed against shield, sandal against stair. In the palace that once echoed with poetry and law, the noise of war unfolded. But it was not a war of kingdoms. It was a battle of presence. In one corner, a boy king desperate to reclaim what he barely understood. In another, a queen who had returned not to conquer, but to remain. And between them, a Roman who had seen empires rise and fall, and now chose the one who had arrived in silence. The skirmish was brief, but loud. Ptolemy XIII fled the palace, his crown left behind on cold stone. And Cleopatra remained, not elevated by blood, but by stillness unbroken. The palace no longer echoed with war. The dust had settled, but not the choices. Cleopatra stood not as a shadow in Caesar's court, but as something else, presence beside him, a question beside every answer. Rome watched, Egypt whispered, and in the quiet space between victory and rule, something fragile began to grow, not written in treaties, not declared in stone, but felt, like the Nile's slow turning, as two rulers stepped closer, not toward power, but toward each other. And every legacy begins with a choice. Soon one would be made, and history would remember it not as strategy, but as love. The palace stood in sunlight, but the air still carried the echo of steel. In Alexandria, the battle had passed. The marble floors no longer bore the weight of soldiers, only footsteps that walked more slowly now, carefully, consciously. The throne, once contested, was quiet, and seated beside it, restored by calculation rather than force, was Cleopatra. Not triumphant, not vindictive, simply returned. Ptolemy XIII had vanished into the Nile's slow current. His youth, his crown, and his war swallowed by the water. Whether drowned in fear or by fate, his end came quietly. The advisors who once ruled through him now stood silent. Their influence thinned. Cleopatra, once hidden in exile, now ruled in full light. Her voice no longer a whisper in the shadows, but the shape of policy and presence. Beside her stood a Roman. Julius Caesar had not come to conquer Egypt, but to reorder it. And in Cleopatra, he found a mind that did not bend, but understood how power turned. Their alliance had not been forged in fire. It had been drawn out in long silences, in shared observations, in the way one understood the weight of rule without needing to declare it. Together, they restored what they could. Cleopatra's younger brother, Ptolemy XIV, barely into adolescence, was named co-ruler. It was tradition. It was diplomacy. It was a formality. The real weight rested with the queen, and Caesar knew it. He did not interfere. He only remained, longer than anyone expected. Seasons shifted quietly around them. In the court, their bond became visible. Not loud, not declared, but known. They met often in the garden courtyards, where vines curled over sandstone and the air held the scent of pomegranates and dust. They spoke of Egypt's grain, of Rome's debts, of trade across the sea. But not just politics. There were pauses between topics, unspoken things that passed between glances and timing, a mutual understanding, a rhythm. To outsiders, it was companionship. To the court, it was a strategy. To history, it would be both. The city whispered. Some saw a queen leaning on foreign power. Others saw a Roman general compromised by affection. Most said nothing. In Egypt, rulers were often gods. But Cleopatra had returned to rule not by divinity, but by wit and survival. And now, she stood beside the most powerful man in the known world. No ceremony, no wedding, just presence. And in time, that presence deepened. Cleopatra was not one to speak of love. She was one to build it slowly, like a temple laid stone by stone with balance and reason. Caesar was not one to show it, but he remained. He walked beside her through the library she had vowed to restore, the scrolls gathered once more after fires and neglect. He spoke of the stars of time, of empires that rose and fell not by might, but by memory. She listened, then spoke of Egypt, not as inheritance, but as responsibility. The people, the harvests, the temples left unguarded. In those conversations, something lasting began to take shape. It was not romance as poets would write it. It was not lust as gossip would suggest. It was something quieter, a shared loneliness among rulers, a recognition. In public, Caesar offered no proclamation. He continued to meet with Egyptian priests, oversaw repairs to Roman garrisons, reviewed merchant agreements. But wherever he went, Cleopatra's name lingered, not as decoration, as necessity. When foreign envoys came to offer tribute, they spoke to both. When judgments were handed down, both names were written. And though her brother sat on the throne beside her, he spoke rarely. He watched more than he ruled. And the city noticed. So did Rome. Word of Caesar's prolonged stay began to drift westward, first as curiosity, then as concern. Senators murmured of distraction, of ambition, of a Roman leader losing sight of boundaries. But in Alexandria, time passed softly. On the river's edge, where reeds swayed in the morning light, Cleopatra and Caesar would walk in silence, their guards at a distance, the sound of sandals over sand. Conversations that began without intent and ended without closure. They did not speak of forever. Rulers rarely do. They spoke of grain routes, of flood patterns, of what could be done if peace held, of what could be possible if trust remained. And beneath those quiet thoughts, something began to grow. Not yet a legacy, but the shadow of one. The Nile flowed gently, as it always had, but now it carried more than trade and prayer. It carried the quiet weight of a future neither ruler had planned aloud. And soon that future would have a name. Time passed without announcement. In the gardens of the palace, vines thickened. Fruit ripened quietly under the Egyptian sun. Life returned to the courtyards, but not with celebration. With rhythm, with routine, with order. And then, in a chamber high above the city, away from the eyes of court and marble, a child was born. A boy. His cry was soft at first, almost cautious, as though uncertain whether he belonged to this world. His mother held him not as a symbol, but as something simpler. As a beginning, Cleopatra named him Ptolemy 15 Caesar, but the people called him Caesarion, Little Caesar. There were no public proclamations, no statues carved, no coins minted, no procession in the streets, but the palace knew, and soon so did Rome. Rumors moved faster than ships. Whispers filled the halls of the Senate, the streets of the Forum, the villas of the elite, that Caesar had fathered a son, that the Queen of Egypt now carried more than just titles. She carried legacy. In Alexandria, Cleopatra moved with the same composure she always had. She ruled, she advised, she walked beside Caesar in chambers lined with lotus columns. But now, her arms sometimes carried more than scrolls. The child was seen rarely, but those who glimpsed him said he looked like his mother, sharp eyes, still features, and something Roman in the way he studied the world, even in infancy. Caesar, for his part, never spoke the child's name publicly, but he did not deny it. He watched the boy with careful quiet, and those near him noted how his silence deepened in the child's presence. There was no crown for Caesarion. Not yet, only time. And in time, the child would become something more than symbol. A thread, a question, a claim. For now, he remained in the shadows of both empires, Egyptian by blood, Roman by possibility. And Cleopatra, ever still, did not rush fate. She simply held her son beneath the painted stars of the palace ceiling, whispering lullabies in a language older than marble. And outside, the Nile flowed as it always had, slow, deep, and watching. But rivers do not stand still, and neither does ambition. Soon, Cleopatra would leave the safety of her palace, not for exile, not for conquest, but to walk once more among marble cities, and to be seen by a world that feared her more than it understood her. Spring brought with it a change in the wind. From the harbors of Alexandria, ships unfurled their sails, large, pale, and stretched tight with purpose. The queen was leaving Egypt, not in exile, not under cover of night, but in full command of her journey. Her destination was not new, but unfamiliar. The center of power, the city of marble, the pulse of an empire, Rome. Cleopatra did not come as a guest. She came as an equal. Her vessel was not a warship, nor a modest barge, but something in between. A floating court trimmed in gold, its banners catching the sun, its shadows gliding across the sea like a procession of silence, with her sailed attendants, advisors, servants, and something more delicate, a child. Caesarion, now just past infancy, accompanied her. His presence was not officially acknowledged by Rome, but he did not hide. Cleopatra carried him openly, as a mother would carry a son, not as a claim, not as a threat, as blood. Their arrival in Rome was met with interest and unease. The city was not prepared for her, not truly. Cleopatra was not like the noble women of the Senate. She wore linen, not wool. She spoke in careful Greek, not fast Latin. She adorned herself in gold, but walked with restraint. She bowed to no one, yet insulted no custom. She stayed not in Caesar's official residence, but across the river, in one of his private villas, quietly placed, comfortably distant, but its significance was not lost on anyone. She was not hidden, and in the forum, another whisper passed into stone. A statue of Cleopatra was placed in the temple of Venus Genetrix, the divine ancestor of Caesar's line. Not tucked away, not symbolic, visible. A queen rendered in marble, her form draped in Egyptian robes. To some, it was an offering, to others, an outrage. In Senate halls, voices sharpened. Caesar had already begun to unsettle Rome with reforms that bent the old order. New laws, land policies, extended powers. Now, there was talk that he would declare himself king, or worse, build a dynasty, with Cleopatra as queen, and her son as heir. In private homes, senators whispered over wine. In temples, priests watched the skies. In the streets, crowds swelled with rumors. The boundaries of Rome, so carefully drawn, so fiercely guarded, had begun to blur, and Cleopatra remained still. She did not interfere in Caesar's politics. She did not speak at public gatherings. She did not appear before the Senate. She walked through gardens with her child. She met quietly with philosophers, artists, and astrologers. She visited shrines. She studied the patterns of power not by speech but by silence. She had entered the lion's den not with fear, but with focus. Her presence was her statement. She was not a distraction. She was a reality. And though Caesar never named Caesarion as his heir, he allowed the world to wonder. He allowed questions to rise like smoke, lingering in the corners of power. Perhaps it was deliberate, perhaps it was careless, but it was dangerous. The longer Cleopatra remained, the louder the whispers became. And in Rome, whispers were warnings. For some, she symbolized something thrilling, a future unbound by Roman tradition, a union of East and West, of intellect and empire. But for others, those rooted in the old ways, she was a threat wrapped in perfume and gold. A queen who had no place in their republic. A woman too clever to trust. And yet, Caesar did not ask her to leave. He knew what her presence meant. He knew what the Senate feared. And still, he kept her close. Perhaps he thought his power too great to challenge. Perhaps he believed history would bend. But Rome was listening, and Rome was ancient in its ways. One morning, the air changed, not with wind, with silence. Cleopatra stood at the edge of the garden, her son in her arms. Across the river, the bells did not ring. The usual clatter of chariots, the market calls, the barking orders of the guard, all fell away. News travels fastest when it is too heavy to carry. Julius Caesar was dead, struck down not on the battlefield, not in civil war, but in the heart of his own empire, stabbed by men he once called allies inside the theater of Pompey, where law once reigned. 23 wounds, and no one to protect his legacy. The queen did not cry. Queens rarely do. But as Rome held its breath, Cleopatra turned toward the sea. The empire had spoken, and in the silence that followed, a mother prepared to protect her son. The marble city had fallen quiet, not from mourning but from tension, from uncertainty, from fear that moved faster than flame, yet left no smoke behind. Caesar was dead. The man who had bent the republic, stretched its laws, walked like a king among men. Now gone in an instant, carved from history not by enemies, but by those who once called him friend. Cleopatra stood across the Tiber, not among the mourners, not before the Senate, but in the garden of Caesar's villa. She did not weep. Her face, always composed, showed no tremble, but something inside her stilled. This was not just the loss of an ally. It was the crumbling of a path, a shield, a future once imagined. The Senate called it a defense of the Republic. The people called it murder. The streets called it chaos. And Cleopatra, far from Alexandria, heard it all in silence. She had come not to take Caesar's Rome, but to understand it. Now, Rome had turned inward, devouring its own. And in that turning, it no longer had space for her, or for her son. Caesarion, barely walking, now stood as a symbol too dangerous to exist freely. Not yet declared heir, not yet denied, just enough to be feared. Cleopatra understood what must come next. She did not wait for invitation, nor exile. She gathered her robes, summoned her ships, and prepared to return, not in defeat but in protection. For Egypt still breathed, its fields still bloomed, its temples still stood, and within it her child would grow, not under the eyes of Roman daggers, but beneath the sky that raised her. The voyage back held no celebration, no trumpets, no gold banners, only wind, only salt, only thought. Behind her, Rome argued over power. Ahead of her, Egypt waited. Between them, a name that still lingered: Caesar. Not the man, now the boy. And Cleopatra would see to it that his legacy was not written by strangers. She returned to her kingdom not in chains, not in triumph, but in quiet armor. One ruler lost, another growing, and soon Egypt would belong to no one but her. The sails furled as Alexandria reappeared on the horizon. The waters of the Nile welcomed her with their usual silence. No judgment, no celebration, just movement. Cleopatra stepped ashore not as a lover returning, nor as a queen adorned in victory. She returned as something quieter, something firmer. A widow, not in marriage but in alliance, in possibility, in legacy. Julius Caesar was gone, but his presence still followed her, in every decision she now made, in every whisper that clung to her child. Caesarion, too young to understand the weight of his name, watched birds fly over palace columns, unaware that in him rested the trembling hopes of two worlds. Within the palace, Cleopatra resumed her throne. The courtiers bowed again, the advisors returned to their roles. But the atmosphere had shifted. What once had been survival was now sovereignty. No Roman general stood beside her. No foreign power shielded her rule. There was only her voice and those who listened. Yet one piece remained. Ptolemy XIV, her younger brother and official co-ruler, still occupied the throne beside her. A child still, but a legal barrier to what she now required: absolute control. Not for ambition, but for clarity, for safety, for her son. His death came quietly. No trial, no conflict, no announcement, only stillness. And in that stillness, Caesarion was elevated, named co-ruler of Egypt, a child pharaoh alongside his mother. Not crowned in grandeur, but wrapped in legacy. His father's shadow reached across the sea, and Cleopatra made sure that Egypt recognized it. Not to provoke Rome, but to remind it. In the temples, his name was carved in stone. In the scrolls, his lineage was written with care. In the queen's eyes, he was not a replacement. He was the future, and now Egypt belonged to them, mother and son, ruler and heir, no longer divided by fragile alliances or foreign guardianship. It was a quiet transformation, but in the silence, something unshakable took root. Yet fate does not rest, and neither do empires. Across the sea, power reshaped itself. Rome turned inwards, but its shadow still reached across the waters. And Cleopatra, now a mother, a ruler, a widow without name, stood alone, not in weakness, but in full command of silence. The sea had closed behind her, and with it, the last trace of Caesar. Alexandria received its queen with silence, not celebration. The city had changed since she left, older, more watchful. The stones remembered the wars. Its people remembered the famine. But now it remembered her. Cleopatra did not return to mourning. She returned to rule. Her brother, Ptolemy XIV, still bore the title of co-ruler, but little else. A boy, once used by others to wield power, now stood in the way of a future she could no longer leave uncertain. No trial followed, no rebellion, only stillness. His death came like a whisper, and in the place beside her throne, Caesarion, the child born of alliance, of calculation, and something deeper, was named king in name, though still too small to speak for himself. The court adjusted, the priests obeyed, the advisors nodded, and Cleopatra ruled alone, not as regent, not as ornament, but as sovereign. She had learned long ago that thrones are not protected by sentiment. They are preserved by silence, by steadiness, by survival. And now she carried them all. Egypt was wounded but breathing. Its economy weakened from years of civil unrest. Its fields thirsty from irregular floods. She turned her attention inward, repairing, restoring, repositioning. The grain stores were reorganized. Land ownership was reviewed. The harbors watched more closely. Everything she touched became part of a quiet reconstruction. But her gaze still turned west. Rome had not vanished. It had only changed shape. Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, and Mark Antony, his most trusted general, now moved through the ruins of the Republic like rival stars. Their power grew, but their direction was unclear. Cleopatra did not interfere. She sent no army, only gifts, messages, careful greetings. She knew that to choose too soon was to risk everything. So she waited. In marble halls, she listened. In the shadows of temples, she prayed. And in council chambers, she ruled alone. Her officials grew quiet, not from fear, from awe, from uncertainty. There was no husband, no Roman protector, no brother beside her. She issued commands without needing to raise her voice. She made laws that needed no defense. She smiled rarely and only when she chose. To the outside world, she became an idea more than a woman. But even ideas can feel the cold. She walked alone beneath colonnades once filled with advisors. She read in libraries where voices no longer interrupted. She dined in silence while Caesar Ion played nearby, unaware of the world slowly folding itself around his name. There was no rebellion. There was no collapse, only quiet rule. And in that quiet, Cleopatra shaped herself into something else. No longer just a queen, a symbol, a goddess reborn. The temples welcomed her as Isis, not in metaphor, but in marble and gold. She appeared in sacred processions with her son at her side, veiled in linen, crowned in uraeus. She funded restorations of shrines. She honored the priests. She offered grain not just to feed, but to inspire faith. To her people, she was not alone. She was divine, but the goddess watched the horizon. Rome was not still, could not be. Brutus and Cassius, Caesar's murderers, were now hunted. The Republic's bones had been scattered, and from its dust rose two powers, Antony and Octavian, now bound by convenience, not trust. They would come, she knew. Not today, not tomorrow, but soon. And as the Nile curved beneath the stars, Cleopatra prepared, not for war, not for surrender, but for a meeting written in silence long before it was spoken. A Roman would sail into her world once more, but this time it would not be Caesar. It would be Antony. The invitation was not unexpected. From Rome's shifting alliances, Mark Antony now stood among the highest. General, orator, triumvir, a man of campaigns, of scars, of roaring ambition. And now he called for Cleopatra, not as queen, not as threat, but as supplicant. She did not respond with words. She answered with a vessel. From Alexandria's harbor, a golden barge moved silently across the sea. Not hurried, not humble, designed not for speed but for memory. Its sails billowed with purple silk, its hull carved in ivory and cedar. On its deck, silver oars dipped into the water in rhythm, not labor. Musicians played softly, their melodies floating with the wind. At the center sat Cleopatra, crowned not with jewels, but with symbol, draped as Isis, goddess of fertility and life. Her robes shimmered like light caught in still water. Perfumes drifted across the bay. Frankincense, myrrh, lotus. The scent arrived before the ship. So did the story. The people of Tarsus gathered along the shore. Soldiers leaned from balconies. Traders paused at the riverfront. No proclamation had been made. No escort marched through the streets. But the queen had arrived. Not with an army, with presence. Antony, known for his bravado, found himself still. He had seen queens before. He had walked with emperors. He had conquered cities. But this was different. This was a vision crafted with care. A message not shouted, but shown. Cleopatra stepped from the barge not like a visitor but like a tide. Unhurried, inevitable. Her attendants followed in silence. Their pace was slow, their eyes forward. No gold changed hands, but the balance of power shifted. There were no declarations made that day, no diplomatic scrolls exchanged, but everyone in Tarsus saw what was true. She had come as a queen, and he had become the audience. It was not love at first glance. It was something colder, recognition. She had not begged. She had not explained. She had performed, and the performance was perfect. That night, Antony did not speak of war. He spoke of Egypt, of perfume, of wine, of myth, and Cleopatra, still veiled in silk and silence, listened with the patience of a woman who had already won. Antony was a soldier. He had lived among swords, marched beside dust, listened to the crack of banners in foreign wind. His victories were loud, his friendships louder. Subtlety was not his nature. He was used to taking territory, loyalty, admiration, to win, to conquer, to command. But Cleopatra offered him nothing to take. Instead, she offered him space to observe, and in that space she ruled. From the moment she stepped onto the soil of Tarsus, she refused to meet Antony as subordinate or petitioner. She did not mention Rome. She did not speak of Caesar. She let the perfume of the moment rise, settle, and wrap around the man like a silk he couldn't see, only feel. Their first meetings were not councils. They were evenings under open skies, feasts not of indulgence, but of orchestration. Fruit sliced without sound, wine poured without asking, music played from reed flutes, each note drifting slowly through the air like thought before words. Cleopatra did not fill the silence. She shaped it. When Antony spoke, she listened, not hungrily, not passively, but with full, unwavering attention. She asked only when needed, responded only when useful. He spoke of campaigns in Parthia, of battles near the Euphrates, of brothers turned rivals, and cities that had welcomed and rejected him. She answered with stories of the Nile, of floods that rose and fell like dynasties, of temples carved from stone that remembered time, of priests who read omens in ibis bones and stars. She offered him not alliance, but atmosphere. This too was diplomacy, not with ink and seal, but with texture, with the flicker of lamplight on sandstone, with cups filled before emptied, with dancers who did not smile, and hallways that echoed only when walked with caution. Antony had expected negotiation. Instead, he found narrative. She was not the girl Caesar had once sheltered. She was the queen who had survived him. Her kingdom still stood. Her enemies had vanished. She had returned from Rome not in defeat, but in power. And now she stood before Antony, not for favor but for purpose. They shared no throne, but in conversation they met as equals. Antony was no fool. He saw the game unfolding. But it was a game he had never played quite like this. Not with swords, not with speeches, with suggestion, with discipline. And yet, for all its grace, there was strategy behind every motion. Cleopatra needed Roman support, not just for Egypt's borders, but for Egypt's future. She had a child whose name still stirred suspicion in Roman hearts. She had a kingdom whose wealth could fund legions. She had no illusions about the stakes. Antony, too, had calculations. He needed ships. He needed money. He needed legitimacy in the East, far from the cautious eyes of Octavian and the Senate. He saw in Cleopatra a chance to root himself in something more ancient than Rome itself, a legacy dressed in linen, not armor. And so they moved toward each other, not with passion, with precision. They dined, they debated, they walked through gardens lined with lotus and papyrus. The moon became familiar, the night routine, and between them, an unspoken treaty began to form. Not one they would sign, but one they would live, a bond of minds, a mirror of ambition. Their touch came later, but long before that, she had already touched his will. When Antony rose to leave, he did not. The feast extended into days. The games turned to ritual. Cleopatra had offered no chains, but still, he stayed. He was meant to return, to the legions, to the Senate scrolls, to the unfinished wars and wary allies. But when the ships waited for Antony, he did not board. When the letters came, he did not answer. When the days passed, he did not notice. He had entered Alexandria, and Alexandria had its own rhythm. The city offered him no applause. It offered something stranger, stillness, the kind that made him slow his breath without knowing why, the kind that softened the soldier without dulling the edge, the kind that made him feel not dismissed, but redefined. Cleopatra had not asked him to stay, but she made it impossible to leave. He rode through the avenues of marble and sand, past obelisks that had stood before Rome was born. The streets smelled of cinnamon and ink. The air was warm, but not oppressive. At every turn, history whispered, not in books, but in stone. Egypt did not shout its greatness. It let you wander into it quietly and forget you had ever belonged to anything else. And there, within this ancient hush, Cleopatra built something new. Not walls, not armies, but a world designed to entertain a general, but not flatter him. Each evening was different, not grand, but deliberate. Feasts lit by torchlight reflected in still pools. Musicians plucking strings beneath fig trees. Games of chance and wit where the queen always played and often let herself lose. They called themselves the inimitable livers, a circle of companions who dined not in luxury, but in laughter. Cleopatra and Antony drank from cups shaped like lotus flowers, told stories that bled into dawn, and wore garlands braided from herbs that no poet could name. But beneath the laughter lay strategy. This was not leisure, it was legacy. Cleopatra understood Antony's hunger, not for comfort, but for belonging. Rome had given him command, but not companionship. Power, but not peace. He was admired, not understood. Here he was not a triumvir. He was a man, and she not just a queen, but an equal who could both challenge and charm. In the mornings they spoke of governance, of trade routes through Nubia, of grain markets, of temple offerings. In the evenings, they floated down the Nile on painted boats, reading aloud from scrolls and watching the stars ripple across the water. This too was rule, not with decrees but with design. The people of Alexandria watched with silent interest. They had seen lovers come and go, but this was something else. Cleopatra was not submitting. Antony was not conquering. They were circling each other, two magnets of different poles, bound by timing, by need, by recognition. Whispers reached Rome, of the feasts, the laughter, the games, of a Roman general playing king beneath Egyptian skies. But Cleopatra did not change the rhythm. She did not deny the rumors, because rumors, like rivers, flowed in all directions, and some reached exactly where she wanted them to go. For while Antony lingered, her position strengthened. Egypt stood taller. Rome's eye wandered, and in the golden hush of Alexandria's nights, a new balance was forming, not written, not declared, but lived. The Nile does not rush. It bends, curves, carries, and as Antony sat beneath its moonlight, he did not know that soon Cleopatra would offer him more than a bed. She would offer him a crown. He had come for tribute. He had stayed for company. But now Antony remained for something deeper, design. Cleopatra did not offer herself. She offered a vision, not of Egypt alone, but of the East reborn. In quiet chambers behind linen curtains, maps were unrolled, not of borders as they were, but as they could be. Names of forgotten satrapies were spoken again. Trade routes traced with fingertips. Histories revived not from glory, but from necessity. Cleopatra knew what Egypt could provide. Antony knew what he needed. She had silver, wheat, ships, and stability. He had legions, names, and Roman legitimacy. And between them, a contract unfolded, without seal, without ink. It was forged in glances, in pauses, in the spaces between what was said and what was not. In return for her support, Antony offered promise. Not of marriage, not yet, but of acknowledgement. He would recognize Caesarion, her son, as Caesar's heir, quietly, not in Rome but in Egypt. He would allow the boy's name to echo in places where it mattered. A half-truth, perhaps, but in politics, half-truths could weigh heavier than blood. And more, Antony would return again, with armies, with purpose, with presence. But Cleopatra, always aware of time's turning, gave something first. Not just grain, not just gold, but heirs. In the stillness of her palace, beneath painted ceilings and perfumed air, twins were born. A boy, Alexander Helios, named for the sun. A girl, Cleopatra Selene, named for the moon. Not secrets, not hostages, symbols. Symbols of East and West, of male and female, of lineage reborn. Not Roman, not Egyptian, something new. A dynasty imagined, not inherited. Together, they planned what the old world feared. A world not ruled from Rome, but beside it. But kingdoms are not made in silence for long. And while the Nile flowed gently around their vision, news sailed in faster currents toward Italy. In Rome, eyes narrowed. In temples, whispers grew. And while Cleopatra built a future in gold and children, Antony turned back to a city that had already begun to turn against him. The Nile had wrapped Antony in warmth, but Rome was colder. News had reached the city before he did. Whispers of Cleopatra's feasts, of games that turned generals into guests, of twins born far from the Senate's gaze, of a Roman soldier who had found more than comfort in the arms of Egypt's queen. Rome did not ask for details. It asked for allegiance. And Antony, knowing the weight of perception, returned. Not by will, but by requirement. There was no accusation, but there was expectation. And to meet it, Antony accepted a bond not of passion, but of politics. He married Octavia, the sister of Octavian, Caesar's adopted son, his rising rival, a gesture meant to bind old alliances, a gesture meant to reassure Rome. Cleopatra received the news in Alexandria, not with grief, but with stillness. She did not weep. She did not rage. She watched the river move forward. She understood Rome's games. Antony had not betrayed her. He had simply performed what the city demanded. Cleopatra had never asked for vows. She had asked for strategy, and that he had given. Still, the divide had opened. Antony in Rome, Cleopatra in Egypt. Two rulers with shared ambition, now living on opposite sides of an ocean and a story. The twins remained in Alexandria, symbols of a future still forming, but now wrapped in distance. Octavia was kind, dutiful, respected in Rome. She represented the Republic's hopes for stability. But she was not Cleopatra. She did not carry the weight of kingdoms in her voice. She did not walk as Isis reborn. And Antony, for all his attempts to play the Roman citizen once more, could not forget Alexandria's silence, its rhythm, its queen. His letters returned to Egypt. Not poetic, not romantic, but filled with updates, intentions, reassurances. He wrote of treaties and Senate tensions. She responded with trade numbers, harvest reports, temple expansions. There was no mourning between them, only motion, for both knew this was not the end. This was intermission. But far from Egypt, Octavian watched more closely now. Not with curiosity, with calculation. The idea of Antony and Cleopatra was no longer amusing, it was dangerous. Two sovereigns, two bloodlines, two armies growing stronger, more entangled, and more distant from Roman control. The divide was not just personal, it was imperial, and it would not remain quiet for long. In Alexandria, the children grew. In Rome, so did suspicion. And somewhere between them, a future waited, carved not in marble, but in the shifting sand between two empires. Time moved differently in Alexandria. The children laughed in palace courtyards, their names carrying the echo of gods. Helios, the sun, Selene, the moon, and Caesarion, the child who bore the weight of two worlds. Cleopatra watched them grow with the gaze of a ruler, not a mother. Every step they took was a step in her design. The palace breathed in ritual, offerings made to Isis at dawn, philosophers reciting poetry in shaded halls, priests lighting incense in long corridors. Cleopatra ruled not with noise, but with rhythm. Egypt had quieted under her hands. The fields produced. The temples flourished. The people, though watchful, did not stir. But the stillness could not last. From Rome, messages arrived bearing more than news. They carried shadows. Octavian, rising with each year, began to reshape the story. Cleopatra was no longer spoken of as queen. She became a sorceress, a seductress, a foreign threat wrapped in silk and ambition. Rumors spread faster than armies, of feasts, of poison, of spells. Antony, still bound by politics in Rome, began to strain beneath the weight of dual lives. In public, he stood beside Octavia. In private, his thoughts drifted east. When Parthia stirred again, Antony saw an opportunity not just for war but for return. He could leave Rome, gather forces, and march east. And from there, he could step once more into Cleopatra's world, not as guest, but as partner. Cleopatra, always patient, prepared in silence. Ships were mended, storehouses filled, gold counted, weighed, hidden. She had learned to plan for men before they arrived. She had learned to trust only preparation. And then the message came. Antony was returning, not for leisure, not for wine, not for stories, but for war. The tides had begun to shift. The waves that once brought alliance now carried something sharper. Ambition had grown, suspicion too, and somewhere beyond Alexandria's calm shores, Octavian was watching, waiting, counting every movement like a blade being drawn inch by inch. As the ships of Antony turned eastward once more, Cleopatra stood upon her balcony, eyes fixed on the horizon. She did not smile. She did not blink. She simply waited, for love, for legacy, and for the first true crack in Rome's illusion of control. Antony returned not as a conqueror, but as a man seeking continuity. From the hills of Rome to the shores of Alexandria, his footsteps no longer echoed with certainty. Behind him, he had left a wife, Octavia, noble and obedient, still loyal despite neglect. In front of him, a queen waited, not with welcome, but with expectation. Cleopatra stood not at the harbor, but in the palace. She had not summoned musicians. She had not lit torches. She had prepared no ceremony. She did not need to. Her presence was its own gravity. Antony entered not as a guest this time, but as partner. There were no veils to lift, no riddles to decipher. Their union now was not built on novelty. It was built on shared strategy, shared survival, and the momentum of what they had already begun. Together, they resumed the work. Plans were reawakened, temples rededicated, coins struck with their faces. Their children, their heirs, grew in marble halls, with languages whispered in both Greek and Latin. Alexandria breathed again, not with celebration, but with purpose. Rome watched in silence. The distance between republic and queen grew wider, and with every quiet day in Alexandria, the shape of a new empire slowly emerged, neither Roman nor Egyptian, but something entirely its own. In that silence, a child was born, not of alliance, but of permanence. And with him, the lines of blood and power blurred even further. The palace echoed with quiet celebration, not of drums, not of trumpets, but of lineage. A third child was born to Cleopatra and Antony, Ptolemy Philadelphus, a name drawn from ancient tradition, from rulers who once wore the double crown of Egypt and claimed the lands of the East as inheritance. The birth was not announced with banners. It did not reach Rome with urgency, but within the walls of Alexandria, it marked something deeper, a completed symmetry. 3 children now bore the union of Rome and Egypt. Alexander Helios, the sun, Cleopatra Selene, the moon, and now Philadelphus, the legacy of brothers and dynasties. They were not merely children. They were symbols Each step they took across polished marble halls was part of something larger, a dynasty shaped not by conquest but by design. Cleopatra watched them with eyes that measured not emotion, but future. She instructed their tutors, selected their attire, chose their languages. They were raised in ritual, in discipline, in story, not to serve but to rule. Antony, too, saw them not as a departure from Rome, but as a vision beyond it. In them, he imagined a world not governed by Senate votes or civil unrest, but by legacy written in blood, stone, and tradition. It was no longer about rule. It was about continuity. And so, beneath the sunlit courts of Alexandria, a plan took shape, a vision that would no longer wait for Rome's permission. The theater was not built for war. It was built for symbol. In Alexandria, beneath the open sky and marble archways, Cleopatra and Antony staged a moment, not of celebration, but of declaration. It would be remembered as the donations of Alexandria, though no gold changed hands. Instead, it was power divided, displayed, and spoken aloud. Before a gathered crowd of nobles, priests, envoys, and citizens, Antony stood beside Cleopatra, robed in ceremony, not armor. Around them, their children, draped in silk and crown, waited in silence, too young to rule, yet already rulers in name. Antony spoke not as a Roman, but as a man unbound. He named Caesarion King of Kings, heir of Julius Caesar. He gave Armenia to Alexander Helios. Media and Parthia, still only ambitions, he granted in advance. Cleopatra Selene was declared Queen of Cyrenaica and Crete. And Ptolemy, still swaddled, was given Syria and Asia Minor. Cleopatra was called Queen of Kings, not as a wife but as a sovereign. The people watched. Some cheered, others stood still, but all understood. This was no celebration. It was a message. To the east, it promised leadership beyond Roman reach. To the west, it challenged the very idea of who held the future. It was not a declaration of war, but it was close. Far away, in marble halls colder than Alexandria's warmth, a man read the words secondhand, and in their meaning, he found the spark of something far more dangerous, a rival Rome. Rome was not built on silence. It fed on noise, of speeches, of gossip, of applause and accusation. Its streets echoed with the steps of senators and slaves. Its forums pulsed with opinion disguised as truth. But even for a city so used to spectacle, the news from Alexandria arrived like thunder after drought. There had been a ceremony. There had been crowns. There had been children. And worse, there had been titles. The donations of Alexandria did not simply assign land. They assigned destiny. Antony, still a Roman citizen, still a Roman consul, had divided the East as if Rome no longer mattered. As if his authority came not from the Senate, but from the throne beside Egypt's queen. Rome had not voted. Rome had not agreed. Rome had only watched. Octavian did not respond at first. He allowed the news to settle like dust, thin, silent, but everywhere. Let the senators whisper. Let the people speculate. Let the temple priests wonder whether Jupiter had been replaced by Ra. Then, with deliberate calm, he began to reshape the narrative. Cleopatra, once an exotic curiosity, became a threat, not just to Antony but to Rome itself. She was portrayed as a seductress, a manipulator, a sorceress cloaked in linen and gold. No longer queen, usurper. Antony, too, was recast. No longer the loyal general. Now the traitor swayed by perfume and pleasure, a Roman lost to foreign gods and foreign ideas. The man who once held Caesar's cloak at his funeral was now accused of turning his back on the Republic. And Octavia, Antony's Roman wife, the symbol of alliance, became a symbol of humiliation. She had done no wrong. She had borne children. She had obeyed custom. Yet her husband had left her for a queen who wore cobras on her crown. This, Octavian knew, would wound Rome's pride far deeper than policy ever could. He acted slowly, but with precision. Private letters were made public. Words never meant to leave ink and parchment were read aloud in forums. In these letters, Antony's plans for Cleopatra, for their children, and for burial in Alexandria were exposed. Whether true or altered, they achieved their purpose. The Roman people stirred. The Senate, always cautious, now bristled. The eastern provinces were being carved up by a man who no longer spoke Rome's language, no longer played Rome's games. It was not yet war, but the soil had been broken, and Octavian began to sow. In the streets, graffiti appeared, Antony as puppet, Cleopatra as master. In plays, satirists mocked Alexandria's grandeur. At feasts, nobles whispered lines from Antony's letters like poems, half joking, half fearing. But not all were fooled. Some senators still respected Antony's record. Some believed the East must be ruled differently than the West. But those voices grew quieter as Octavian tightened his grip. He needed not consensus, only momentum. To the people, he promised defense. To the Senate, he promised order. To the gods, he promised nothing. Rome's will was its own, and so the stage shifted, not toward peace, not yet toward battle, but toward the moment where lines would need to be drawn. Octavian knew Cleopatra would never kneel, and Antony, whether by loyalty or pride, would not turn back. The donations were not just a statement of love or ambition. They were a provocation, and in Rome's marble heart, one man now held the quill to rewrite the future. In Alexandria, the Nile continued to flow, oblivious to the anger rising far away. But the calm would not hold. The tides had shifted, and soon ships would follow. The days passed, and the silence between Rome and Alexandria thickened. Cleopatra felt it in the stillness of the court, an absence not of sound, but of certainty. The air grew dense with whispers. Merchants arriving from the west carried not goods, but glances. Priests offered prayers in double meanings. The stars above the temple of Isis glowed the same, but the future they watched over was shifting. In Rome, the curtain had lifted. Octavian stood in the Senate, not as a young man in the shadow of Caesar, but as a figure carved from ambition itself. With calm hands, he laid out Antony's letters, Antony's promises, Antony's betrayals. Not all of it was true. Not all of it needed to be. Truth, like loyalty, was a flexible thing in Rome. The donations of Alexandria were painted as an insult, a challenge, a foreign coronation that mocked Roman law. Antony had named Caesarion King of Kings, but to Octavian, this was heresy. No one could be heir to Caesar but himself. Cleopatra's children were declared threats. Her titles a mockery, her influence a disease creeping east to west. Octavian moved carefully but decisively. The alliance, the triumvirate, was declared broken. Antony was stripped of all official titles. And so, without sword drawn or army moved, war began. Not in the name of Antony, but in the name of Egypt. Rome would not wage civil war again, not in name. Octavian declared the enemy not a Roman general, but a foreign queen. It was Cleopatra, not Antony, who stood accused. Her ambition, her gods, her gold, her charm, all cast as poison infecting the Republic. And from that framing, Rome rose united once more, not for conquest, but for purification. In the golden light of Alexandria, Cleopatra stood at her balcony, aware now that the game had changed. The battles ahead would not be for territory, but for memory, for legacy, and for the right to write history itself. The sea lay still. From the balconies of the palace, Cleopatra looked west. Not for ships, not yet, but for signs in the wind. The tide had not shifted in water, but in intention. The war had not begun with arrows, but with ink. Still, the consequences would come in waves. Within the quiet stone corridors of the palace, maps were unrolled again. Not as they once were, drawn in soft calculation, rich with possibilities. Now they bore sharper lines. Borders no longer suggested ambition, but defense. Cleopatra understood. Octavian had chosen his strategy. Rome would not fight Antony. Rome would fight Egypt. It was a clever framing. The Republic could not survive another civil war in name, but it could unite against an outsider. A queen. A woman cloaked in myth, gold, and the ghosts of pharaohs. She had given Octavian what he needed. A symbol. And in this war, symbolism mattered more than legions. So preparations began. Ships were summoned to the harbors. Carpenters worked long hours reinforcing hulls. Scribes copied manifests of supplies. Grain was counted. Horses fed. Armor polished. Soldiers drilled beneath the Egyptian sun, not with chance of conquest, but with quiet, practiced rhythm. Antony joined her in these efforts, not as husband, not even as lover, but as ally. Their bond, once draped in silk and wine, now were iron. They stood not beside each other in gardens, but across long tables scattered with reports and sealed messages. He knew Rome. She knew war. Together, they would answer a question the world had not yet dared to ask. Could the East rise again? In this union, Cleopatra was not a consort. She was a queen with her own fleet, her own army, her own people. Egypt had bent before to foreign generals. It would not bend again. Still, beneath the rhythm of drills and the ordering of arms, something softer stirred. A realization that they were racing not toward triumph, but toward fate. Octavian had momentum. His speeches filled forums. His propaganda flooded amphitheaters and taverns. He was not only shaping war, he was shaping memory. Antony and Cleopatra, in his telling, were no longer rulers. They were shadows, excess, corruption, foreign softness. He painted Cleopatra not as queen, but as enchantress. He stripped Antony of his honor, word by word, and reimagined him as a captive to lust. And yet, Antony did not answer with words. He answered with presence. When the Roman world expected retreat, he advanced. He moved eastward, gathering support from allied kings, reaffirming oaths, collecting ships and men from Asia Minor, Syria, and beyond. His name still held weight, if not in Rome, then in the outlying provinces that remembered his victories. Cleopatra matched him in every effort. She had ruled for nearly 2 decades, survived betrayals, outlived rivals, built and rebuilt alliances. Her rule had not been granted. It had been carved, patiently, strategically, day by day. This war, if it came, would not be her undoing, but it would be her culmination. Still, there were doubts. Some allies hesitated. The eastern provinces, always shifting in loyalty, whispered of outcomes and retreat. The memories of Caesar's murder lingered. Rome's legions, even fractured, remained formidable. But Cleopatra did not sway. She knew what waited if they failed. Not merely defeat, but erasure. Her children, her temples, her memory, buried beneath Roman stones and retold by Roman tongues. She would not vanish silently, so she prepared, not with arrogance, with clarity. Festivals ceased, rituals shortened, the opulence of the palace grew quieter. Even Alexandria, a city of light and learning, dimmed slightly under the weight of anticipation. And in those quiet nights, Antony and Cleopatra walked the colonnades not as lovers lost in myth, but as leaders preparing for the greatest gamble of their lives. It would be sea against sea, narrative against truth, east against west, and it would all come to a head, not in words, but in the open waters of the Mediterranean. The sails had been raised, not in triumph, not in peace, but in quiet defiance. Across the sea, Rome sharpened its silence, and in Alexandria, Cleopatra watched the horizon, not for ships, but for history. What came next would not be a battle for land, nor even for power, but for the memory of a world that dared to exist outside of Rome's shadow. The wind had shifted, and soon the world would follow. In Rome, the marble was colder than usual. The Senate chamber, once filled with echoes of debate, now breathed in silence. Not the silence of peace, but of decision. The kind that comes not with shouting, but with slow nods and signatures on parchment. The war had already begun in hearts and rhetoric, but now it would gain a name. And Rome, ever careful with its image, did not declare war on Mark Antony. It declared war on Cleopatra. It was not a personal vendetta, they said. It was not political revenge. It was preservation of Rome, of virtue, of tradition. The East had grown bold, they claimed. Too bold. A queen who wore gold like armor, who named her son the King of Kings, who dared to distribute Roman lands without Rome's consent. She had crossed a line drawn in marble. Octavian stood at the center of it all, measured, still, and certain. He needed no anger. His campaign had been quiet, efficient. With each word spoken against Cleopatra, the Senate leaned closer. With each scroll leaked from Antony's hand, the Republic's foundations grew firmer. The people had heard enough. The priests had heard enough. Even those who once supported Antony had turned inward, unwilling to defend a man now cast as a servant of the East. And so the vote passed. A war not against a Roman citizen, but against a foreign queen. It was clever, and it was complete. Across the sea, Cleopatra received the news not with fear, but with recognition. It was not unexpected. The pieces had been moving for years. Now the board was cleared of pretense. There would be no more letters, no more alliances, only ships and time. The war had found its name. Now it would begin to find its shape. In sails, in steel, in silence before the clash. The sea did not stir, but preparations moved beneath its surface. Quiet as roots before bloom, steady as tides beneath stillness. The war had been named, and now it waited for its shape. In the East, Antony and Cleopatra gathered their strength. They chose Greece, not Egypt, as their ground of decision. A place closer to Rome, yet not Rome. A coast shaped by old empires, still echoing with the memory of Alexander. The port of Actium became their harbor, not of rest, but of design. Ships came from every corner of their influence. Thick-hulled Egyptian transports, sleek Syrian vessels, galley ships from Asia Minor, grain ships refitted for war. Some bore lions on their prows, others lotus flowers. Together, they formed a fleet not just of nations, but of intentions. Inside the camp, order ruled. Scribes worked beside sailors. Carpenters shaped oars while messengers rode between tents. Spears were sharpened beside scrolls. It was not chaos. It was preparation. Cleopatra moved through it all with measured steps. No longer the queen of whispers and gold-lined gowns. Now a commander, a sovereign. She met with shipbuilders, spoke with officers, approved the rationing of grain. The palace halls had become a command tent, and in them she held her ground. Antony, too, returned to his rhythm. He no longer spoke of Rome. He spoke of routes, of winds, of formations. His voice no longer held charm, it held weight. Between them, words were few. They were no longer lovers wrapped in myth. They were rulers walking toward consequence. But not all was still. In the West, Octavian had not waited. His general, Agrippa, moved first, cutting off supply routes, capturing ports, turning loyal cities with quiet sieges. One by one, the world around Antony's fleet tightened. The storm was not loud, but it was coming. In the shadow of the sails, as armor cooled beneath clouded skies, a silence stretched between two worlds, one about to end, and one waiting to begin. Actium held its breath. The sea, wide and blue, stretched like polished glass beneath a gray sky. Winds whispered through rigging, but the sails remained tied. The ships did not move. The men did not shout. In both camps, Rome and Egypt, stillness became the final preparation. Antony's fleet, grand in number, lined the water like a floating wall. Over 200 ships, many large, some lumbering, built not for pursuit, but for presence. Their decks bristled with archers and artillery. Their prows bore bronze rams, but they sat heavy in the water, weighed down by supplies, by armor, by expectation. Behind them, further inland, the camp stirred gently. Campfires flickered. Officers walked in slow circuits. Scribes recorded final lists. There was little left to organize. What remained was waiting. Cleopatra's ships waited with them. Sleeker, faster vessels clustered toward the rear. Their banners bore Egyptian symbols. The sun disk, the cobra, the open wings of Isis. Unlike the soldiers, her sailors carried no illusions of Roman honor. They followed her not out of loyalty to empire, but to her. Within her pavilion, Cleopatra stayed composed. She did not pray. She did not cry. She reviewed charts, measured winds, marked tides. She understood that war was not only fought with force, but with timing. Antony walked the shoreline, gazing at the horizon. His thoughts did not rest on Octavian. They wandered backward through Parthia, through Philippi, through Rome's broken promises and fading voices. He had once stood on marble steps and spoken to cheering crowds. Now he stood on sand, his voice no longer needed. Across the sea, Octavian's fleet remained hidden, but present. His ships were lighter, more maneuverable. His admiral, Agrippa, had already claimed much of the surrounding coast. Supplies had been choked off. Support was thinning, but the fight had not begun. Not yet. Between wind and water, between choice and consequence, the moment waited, not in thunder, but in breath. The morning came without fanfare. No trumpet signaled its arrival. No omen marked its sky, just the pale light of dawn spilling over anchored ships and shifting waves. On the deck of her flagship, Cleopatra stood still. To the west, Antony paced quietly, his armor already strapped in place. Between them, the sea rolled soft and deep, holding within it a day that would reshape everything. The battle began without a single spoken word. Agrippa's fleet, swift and deliberate, emerged from the horizon like shadows sharpened by sun. Their ships sliced through the waves in tight formation. Lighter, faster, more precise. Antony's line responded. His warships turned, slow and heavy. Their rams pointed outward. Their oars groaned against the current. It was not speed they relied on, but force. If the enemy came close, they would crush them. That was the plan. But the enemy did not come close. Octavian's fleet kept its distance. Harpoons, flaming arrows, quick strikes and sudden retreats. It was not combat, it was erosion. Hours passed. Smoke drifted above the masts. The cries of sailors blurred with crashing waves. Fire took hold of sails. Blood mixed with seafoam. And then, from the rear of the formation, a shift. Cleopatra's fleet, positioned behind Antony's core line, broke formation. They turned and began to sail away, not in panic, not in chaos, but with precision. Her ships cut through the thinning smoke and left the battle behind. A moment passed. Confusion swept the deck. Antony, standing at the edge of his command vessel, watched the sails pull away, golden, proud, unburned, and he followed. Leaving behind his fleet, his men, his cause, he turned toward her. One ship, one choice, and the final severing of Rome's memory. Behind them, the battle collapsed. On the waves, smoke still lingered. On the shore, armor still cooled. And in the quiet that followed, the world took one breath and began to change. The sea did not celebrate. It swallowed the battle without judgment. The waves, once cut by sails and steel, rolled quietly now, washing over broken oars, scorched wood, and silence. The smoke lifted slowly into the sky, not as a warning, but as a memory dissolving into wind. The war, as the soldiers knew it, had ended. On the shores near Actium, Antony's remaining men stood without orders. Some still clutched swords, though no one charged. Others sat in sand, staring toward the horizon, unsure of what they had witnessed. Their leader had left them, not fallen in glory, not captured in chains, but sailed away, vanishing into the same dawn that had promised battle. Word spread like mist across the fleet. Cleopatra had departed. Antony had followed. The command was broken. The plan had collapsed not by force but by absence. In Rome, the news arrived slower, but with clarity. Octavian had not just won a battle. He had unraveled a legend. No statue fell, no walls burned, but something older, something grander, had been extinguished in the salt and smoke. Antony, once a lion of Rome, now became a ghost trailing behind a queen. And Cleopatra, the sovereign of spectacle, the mistress of myth, faded behind sails, her silence louder than any speech. Actium was not a glorious clash. It was a quiet undoing, a moment where two great powers, love and ambition, drifted into retreat, leaving only embers behind. In Alexandria, far from the field of ruin, the port waited. The harbor had seen returns before, of victors, of merchants, of emperors. But this return felt different. There were no songs, no parades, only the slow arrival of ships that carried no triumph, only truth. The world had turned, and the queen would now face it, without armor, without allies, without illusion. The winds carried no answers, the gods no reply, only the tide moved forward, and with it, the end of the age. The ships returned to Alexandria in silence. No horns greeted them, no torches were lit. The city watched from rooftops and balconies, not with celebration, but with still eyes, uncertain, unblinking. The war had left its marks far away, but the defeat had arrived home. Cleopatra stepped off her vessel without ceremony. Her robes were plain, her crown absent. She did not speak. She did not bow. She walked past the harbor, past the guards, past the waiting servants, into the marble halls of her palace as if returning from a long and private storm. Behind her, Antony followed. He no longer walked with command. His armor was unfastened, his sandals wet with seawater. He spoke little. He slept less. The general who once shook mountains now moved like a man carved from sand, washed smooth by waves too strong to resist. Inside the palace, time slowed. The corridors no longer echoed with discussion. There were no envoys, no alliances left to forge. The walls still stood, but they no longer held power. Only memory. Cleopatra met with her advisors, though there was little left to plan. Octavian would come, not with questions, not with treaties, but with Rome itself, measured, relentless, and certain. The queen knew what waited. Still, she prepared. On the waves, smoke still lingered. On the shore, armor still cooled. And in the quiet that followed, the world took one breath and began to change. The sea did not celebrate. It swallowed the battle without judgment. The waves, once cut by sails and steel, rolled quietly now, washing over broken oars, scorched wood, and silence. The smoke lifted slowly into the sky, not as a warning, but as a memory dissolving into wind. The war, as the soldiers knew it, had ended. On the shores near Actium, Antony's remaining men stood without orders. Some still clutched swords, though no one charged. Others sat in sand, staring toward the horizon, unsure of what they had witnessed. Their leader had left them, not fallen in glory, not captured in chains, but sailed away, vanishing into the same dawn that had promised battle. Word spread like mist across the fleet. Cleopatra had departed. Antony had followed. The command was broken. The plan had collapsed not by force but by absence. In Rome, the news arrived slower, but with clarity. Octavian had not just won a battle. He had unraveled a legend. No statue fell, no walls burned, but something older, something grander, had been extinguished in the salt and smoke. Antony, once a lion of Rome, now became a ghost trailing behind a queen. And Cleopatra, the sovereign of spectacle, the mistress of myth, faded behind sails, her silence louder than any speech. Actium was not a glorious clash. It was a quiet undoing, a moment where two great powers, love and ambition, drifted into retreat, leaving only embers behind. In Alexandria, far from the field of ruin, the port waited. The harbor had seen returns before, of victors, of merchants, of emperors. But this return felt different. There were no songs, no parades, only the slow arrival of ships that carried no triumph, only truth. The world had turned, and the queen would now face it, without armor, without allies, without illusion. The winds carried no answers, the gods no reply, only the tide moved forward, and with it, the end of the age. The ships returned to Alexandria in silence. No horns greeted them, no torches were lit. The city watched from rooftops and balconies, not with celebration, but with still eyes, uncertain, unblinking. The war had left its marks far away, but the defeat had arrived home. Cleopatra stepped off her vessel without ceremony. Her robes were plain, her crown absent. She did not speak. She did not bow. She walked past the harbor, past the guards, past the waiting servants, into the marble halls of her palace as if returning from a long and private storm. Behind her, Antony followed. He no longer walked with command. His armor was unfastened, his sandals wet with seawater. He spoke little. He slept less. The general who once shook mountains now moved like a man carved from sand, washed smooth by waves too strong to resist. Inside the palace, time slowed. The corridors no longer echoed with discussion. There were no envoys, no alliances left to forge. The walls still stood, but they no longer held power. Only memory. Cleopatra met with her advisors, though there was little left to plan. Octavian would come, not with questions, not with treaties, but with Rome itself, measured, relentless, and certain. The queen knew what waited. Still, she prepared. The treasury was sealed. Royal tombs were inspected. Vaults were emptied of scrolls and offerings. The temples received their last sacrifices. The rites continued not for the gods but for dignity. The rhythm of Egypt would not falter, even as the storm approached. Caesarion remained hidden, tended by loyal tutors, guarded by silence. Cleopatra spoke to him not as a mother, but as a mirror, passing down lessons not of ruling, but of surviving a world that had forgotten how to honor bloodlines. Outside, the people whispered, not of rebellion, not of escape, but of endings. The stars still shone above the city. The Nile still flowed, ancient and unmoved. But in the heart of Egypt's last queen, the world had already begun to let go. Alexandria stood still. The sun fell softer on its white walls. The wind moved gently through the empty courtyards, and the once proud capital of Egypt no longer whispered of glory, but of endings. Octavian had crossed the sea. His armies marched not with chaos, but with order. Silent columns of Rome's precision. No flames, no destruction, only inevitability. Each step forward pressed the city's path deeper into shadow. Inside the palace, Cleopatra waited. She did not command. She did not resist. She observed, not as a queen preparing for battle, but as a witness to her own fading. The corridors, once filled with voices, now echoed softly with footsteps. Servants moved quietly. Advisors spoke less. There were no plans left, only rituals, and records, and time. Mark Antony no longer held counsel. His sword remained sheathed. He wandered through the colonnades in silence, not defeated in body, but undone in purpose. Their empire had become a memory before it had even ended. And yet Cleopatra stood tall, not proud, not broken, but still, waiting not for Rome's arrival, but for the final shape of what would remain once everything else had fallen. Outside, the banners of Rome drew nearer, but inside the palace, a different battle stirred, not of weapons, but of love, illusion, and loss. The palace grew quieter. Word reached Antony not through messengers, but through murmurs. Cleopatra was dead. It came as a whisper carried through stone halls, as a glance between servants, as a breath held too long. He did not question it. He did not confirm. He simply believed. The thought landed in him like a blade already drawn, a silence too heavy to hold. Cleopatra, the woman he had followed across empires, across years, across honor, was gone. And so he chose to follow her, not with ceremony, not with war cries, but with the one gesture Rome had taught him best, a Roman death. He unsheathed his sword in the quiet of his chamber and turned the edge toward his chest. The pain came quickly, but the end did not. The wound was deep but not final. He fell, bleeding, not finished, dying but still present. And then, a message. Cleopatra was not dead. Not yet. The lie had been planted as strategy, a final attempt to protect him, or to move him, or to save what could no longer be held. Guards carried his body through secret corridors, down into her mausoleum already built, already waiting. There, in a chamber meant for the dead, she cradled him in her arms. No kingdom remained, no war to win, only two stories closing together. Outside, Rome gathered its terms. But within stone walls, the queen measured time. Not in treaties, but in heartbeats left. She remained in her mausoleum, a structure not of mourning, but of preparation. The walls were polished, the air cool. Gold inlay lined the edges of stone. Offerings sat in neat rows, coins, scrolls, perfumes. Everything had been arranged long before the war ended. Cleopatra had always known how stories would end. She sat near Antony's body, silent, still, a queen without a throne, a woman without a future, a legacy wrapped in linen and silence. Octavian sent word. He would not destroy the city. He promised mercy, promised Caesarion might live, promised Cleopatra safety if she would surrender. But Cleopatra understood promises. She had ruled through them, broken them, shaped them. She asked to meet Octavian. He refused. Instead, he sent messengers, guards, physicians. She was to be watched, studied, preserved, alive. But Cleopatra had no interest in being displayed in chains. She would not be paraded through Roman streets, a relic, a trophy. Egypt's queen would not survive as a spectacle. She returned to her marble room and waited, not for rescue, not for mercy, but for the last moment she could still call her own. The Nile still flowed, the sun still rose, but within the chamber of polished stone, Egypt prepared to fall with its queen, quietly, completely, and on her own terms. The end came without spectacle. There was no thunder, no scream, no crowd, only silence. Within the mausoleum, Cleopatra prepared herself. Robes of white linen, jewels carefully chosen, her crown untouched, yet unworn. She lay beside Antony. Two lives entwined not only in power, but in surrender. She took no army with her, no advisors, no ceremony. Only two handmaidens stood by, faithful to the end. They brought the basket, sealed, simple, resting at her feet. Some say it held fruit. Others, a coiled asp hidden in figs. No one truly knows. History would become rumor. Rumor would become legend. But the result was clear. Moments later, she was still. Her handmaiden fell beside her. Then the second. By the time Octavian's guards forced open the chamber doors, it was already over. There was no queen left to capture, no triumph to display, only a body adorned in silk, a face composed in peace, and a silence deeper than conquest. Octavian looked upon her not with rage, but with calculation. He had won the war, but the final moment belonged to her. She had escaped his victory, not through battle, but through control. The queen was gone, but her blood still flowed. In a child Rome feared, and in that child's fate, the last thread of a dynasty, hung by a breath. Caesarion was 15, too young to rule, too old to be ignored. He carried two names, one Roman, one Egyptian, two heritages, two legacies, and in the eyes of Octavian, one danger. He had not fought in any war, had not spoken in any court, but in his veins ran the blood of Caesar and the throne of Egypt. That was enough. After Cleopatra's death, he was brought from hiding, taken gently but not freely. There were whispers of negotiation, hopes of exile, dreams that he might live quietly, far from Rome's reach. But Rome does not forget, and it does not forgive threats that wear crowns. The order came quietly, not from a judge, not from a senate, but from Octavian himself. The boy was killed. No tomb was built, no statue raised. His name, once carved beside gods and kings, was erased. The last pharaoh of Egypt did not rule. He was not buried in gold or stone. He disappeared into history, and with him, the bloodline of the Ptolemies ended. 300 years of rule, of gods walking in temples, of queens commanding fleets, of a city that once rivaled Rome, fell silent. Not with flames, but with removal. The dynasty was broken, the temples emptied, and where once stood a queen, now stood only a memory, and a city adjusting to its silence. The Nile did not rise or fall in grief. Its waters moved as they always had, slow, steady, unchanging. The river had seen kings and empires, temples and tyrants, gods and graves. It did not pause for the end of Cleopatra. Alexandria adapted. The banners changed. The orders shifted. Roman governors arrived, clean and efficient. Temples were catalogued. Statues were measured. Gold was counted. Egypt had not been conquered by fire, but by transition. Octavian stood at the edge of the queen's tomb. He did not destroy it, perhaps out of respect, perhaps out of politics, perhaps because history sometimes prefers to preserve its trophies. He returned to Rome not just as a victor, but as something more, the sole power. He would be called Augustus, not a man, but a beginning. And Egypt, it became a province, a jewel with no queen, a crown with no head, the city of scholars, of scrolls, of secrets, drifted into silence beneath Roman rule. No monument rose for Cleopatra, but her name survived, not in law, not in coin, but in story, soft, persistent, impossible to bury. The queen was gone, the empire dissolved, but in every whisper of her name, a question still remained. Who was Cleopatra, and why does she still endure? The queen was gone, the dynasty ended, and the land that once called itself divine was now property of Rome. Egypt did not collapse in fire or revolution, fell into silence. Octavian stood at the center of this silence. The man who had outlasted Caesar, outmaneuvered Antony, and now outlived Cleopatra. His victory was complete, not with blood on his sword, but with no one left to resist. He annexed Egypt without fanfare. No riots, no rebellion. Alexandria, once a city of scholars and merchants, temples and gods, adjusted itself like a shifting riverbank. It accepted new rulers, new orders, new rhythms. Temples were still visited. Markets still opened. The Nile still rose. But everything moved differently. The pulse had changed. The breath of the city was slower. Octavian would return to Rome as Augustus, the first emperor of the Roman world. Egypt, once a kingdom ruled by gods and queens, became a province, ruled not by divinity, but by decree. And Cleopatra? Her name was not carved into new monuments. No new shrines were raised. Her image was not struck in Roman coin. She had chosen her end, and with it, chosen the limits of her memory. What remained was not hers to control. Stories travel faster than armies, and after Cleopatra's death, it was not Egypt that spoke, but Rome. Roman historians, poets, and politicians shaped her image with pen and parchment. Plutarch, writing years later, painted a portrait vivid and rich, a queen of wit, charm, danger, and power. But his version, like all that came after, was shaped not by knowing her, but by hearing echoes. They called her seductive, manipulative, mysterious, not because these words were accurate, but because they served the narrative. Cleopatra, in Roman ink, became less a woman and more a mirror, reflecting Rome's fears, desires, and triumphs. She was blamed for Antony's fall, called an enchantress, a foreign temptress. She became a symbol of excess and betrayal, the East embodied in a single woman. But beneath these layers, something deeper lingered. Even in Roman scorn, there was fascination. They could not forget her. Even as they condemned her, they preserved her. She had defied them. She had ruled, commanded, chosen. And in the end, she had denied them the spectacle of her capture. Rome had won the war, but Cleopatra had written her own final act. And in that refusal to surrender, she became more than a casualty. She became a myth. Over centuries, the real Cleopatra faded. What replaced her was 1,000 versions stitched together, a tapestry of contradictions. Each generation painted her anew, Each culture chose its own mask. In medieval Europe, she was temptation. In Renaissance drama, she was tragedy. In colonial imaginations, she was the exotic East. And in modern retellings, she became power, beauty, rebellion, or desire, depending on the storyteller. But behind all this, the truth remained hazy. Few facts survived. Her writings are gone, her tomb lost, her voice silenced not just by death, but by the control of those who outlived her. Was she manipulative, or merely strategic? Was she in love, or in alliance? Did she crave power, or simply survival? We do not know, and that not knowing became part of her myth. She exists in fragments, coins, carvings, scattered lines in Roman texts. But these fragments are smoke. They drift between truth and invention. Still, the image endures, perhaps not despite the mystery, but because of it. Cleopatra became a symbol not of one truth, but of many unanswered questions. In the end, she became more powerful in myth than she ever was in marble. Art remembered what empires erased. From brush to canvas, pen to page, Cleopatra reemerged, not in temples or tombs, but in imagination. Painters draped her in gold and indigo. Writers gave her words she never said. Theaters lit stages with her shadow. Shakespeare gave her sorrow. Hollywood gave her spectacle. Elizabeth Taylor's eyes in coal. Monumental sets, desert winds, crowds parting for a queen. And through each version, her figure shimmered, changing yet constant. A symbol, a question, a name. She was not the first powerful woman, but she became a measure by which others were compared. In every age, Cleopatra was reborn to reflect the moment. In revolution, she became a rebel. In feminism, a woman in control. In empire, a danger. In romance, a flame. What she actually thought, what she feared, what she planned, those truths were lost. But her story refused to die. Perhaps because she made choices men were never allowed to forget. And because she died in a way they could not rewrite. Cleopatra's tomb has never been found. Archaeologists still search. Scholars still argue. Legends still whisper of a resting place by the sea or beneath the temple of Taposiris Magna. But her absence is its own presence. Because in not finding her, she remains unclaimed. No single place can contain her. No final line can close her story. She lingers where memory meets myth, an echo that does not fade, even when the voice is gone. In libraries, her name fills pages. In classrooms, her life sparks debate. In art, she appears without end. In culture, she is referenced, reinterpreted, reclaimed. What other ruler has been so often remade? What other queen has lived so long without living at all? Her voice may be lost, but her silence speaks. A silence that asks, who decides what is remembered? A silence that reminds, power leaves traces, even when erased. And perhaps that is her truest legacy. Not the Egypt she ruled, but the image she left behind. One that cannot be buried, cannot be silenced, and cannot be owned. The Nile still flows. Its waters remember nothing, yet carry everything. Through sand and time, over stone and root. It has outlived empires, washed over kings, and mirrored the stars since long before Cleopatra breathed. And still her story rises. Not in pyramids or palaces, but in questions, in portrayals, in retellings. A woman long gone, still spoken. She was not perfect. She was not immortal. But she was not simple. And that complexity became her crown. Cleopatra challenges the lines between ruler and woman, between myth and record, between power and perception. Her legend endures because it cannot be fully shaped, only studied, glimpsed, imagined. She reminds us that history is not fixed, that the past is a conversation, and that even in silence, some voices still echo. Rome claimed her land, but not her meaning. She belonged to Egypt, to herself, and now to the world. So let the scrolls debate, let the statues fade, let the sands cover the stones where her footsteps once fell. Cleopatra does not need to be found to be remembered. She endures where history breathes softly, where memory flickers like a lamp in still air, where gold becomes dust and dust becomes light. This is not her ending, only her return. Part 1. The Missing Tomb. Cleopatra's final resting place remains a mystery. Legends speak of a secret tomb near the Temple of Taposiris Magna, but no conclusive evidence has surfaced. Her choice to vanish in death mirrored her control in life. In not being found, she resists ownership. Archaeologists search, but what they seek may never be uncovered. Her absence leaves space for speculation, myth, and reverence. A queen who controlled her narrative, even beyond death. And so, she waits. Not buried, but remembered in silence. Part 2. The real face of Cleopatra. Her face survives only on worn coins and biased words. Roman authors painted her as beautiful and dangerous, but the truth may lie elsewhere. Coins depict a sharp nose, firm chin, features of strength, not softness. Egypt knew her as divine, Rome as a threat. Her appearance became a canvas for fear, admiration, and projection. We may never know how she truly looked, but her image endures, not in symmetry, but in power. Part 3. The ASP and her death. The story of the ASP is seductive, but uncertain. Did a snake really end the queen's life? Or was poison smuggled in a comb, a fig basket, a needle? Ancient texts conflict. Roman writers favored drama, not detail. What mattered was the symbolism. A queen who chose death over defeat. Her method remains unclear, but the meaning is not. Cleopatra's end was not surrender. It was a final act of authorship. Part 4. Caesarion's fate. Caesarion, the boy king, was Cleopatra's last hope for an independent Egypt. After her death, he vanished from history. Some say Octavian ordered his execution. Others whisper of escape, exile, or survival in obscurity. There are no records, only fragments and silences. The end of Caesarion marked the true fall of the Ptolemies. His fate, like his mother's, became a question more powerful than any answer. Part 5. Her secret alliances. Power rarely moves in straight lines. Cleopatra's reign was woven with unseen threads, whispers, letters, and shadowy deals. She navigated Roman factions with precision. She may have had informants, backchannels, and silent supporters even in Rome. Her survival through multiple crises hints at a hidden network. Not all power is visible, and Cleopatra knew the strength of secrets. Part 6. Cleopatra and ancient magic. To her people, Cleopatra was the living goddess Isis. In Rome, she became the embodiment of sorcery. Later legends cast her as an alchemist, a seer, a mistress of stars and rituals. Whether truth or myth, the connection endures. Ancient queens often blurred the lines between ruler and divine. Cleopatra's magic may not have been spells, but knowledge, presence, and control. Part 7. The Roman narrative machine. Octavian didn't just conquer Egypt, he conquered Cleopatra's memory. Roman poets and historians shaped her story to serve empire. She was rewritten as a temptress, a threat, a cautionary tale. Her victories were erased, her alliances reframed. But even in distortion, she survived. Rome's pen could not destroy her legend, it only spread it further. Part 8. Conspiracy theories. Some say she didn't die, that a body double fooled Octavian, that Caesarion lived in hiding, that her tomb lies beneath Vatican stones or Mediterranean caves. Most theories are fantasy, yet they reveal something true. The world doesn't want her story to end. Myths grow where certainty is lost, and Cleopatra left behind fertile silence. Part 9. The seductress or the strategist. Was Cleopatra ruled by love or ruling through love? Roman sources emphasized passion, but her choices suggest strategy. Her unions with Caesar and Antony were politically sharp. She used intimacy as diplomacy, not weakness. History reduced her to desire, But beneath the veil was a mind shaping kingdoms. Seductress, yes, but also a sovereign. A strategist cloaked in myth. And so, the queen fades not into oblivion but into story, carried not by time, but by those who remember. Her life, a mosaic of myth, power, silence, and light. Her legacy, still unfolding, still uncertain, still alive. If her journey stirred your curiosity, if her story lingered in your thoughts, then let it live a little longer. Subscribe to the channel, turn on the bell, and if her name still echoes softly in your mind, leave a like. This is History Dozer, where the past rests gently and dreams don't sleep.